But then when it turns out dry in July, I wish I had more water, save it, no till. So tillage is all about controlling one of the wonders above it. And I'll show you one example of a tillage previous crop interaction, largely because I have a cool picture of it. But anybody who's ever chisel plowed corn or soybean stubble, oh man, you know those crops work up differently. I'm going to show you one day after a fall chisel plow on my previous crop nurseries. This is one day after a fall chisel plow. And I call all my research fields nurseries, because I've discovered if you call your research site a nursery, as opposed to just a regular field, now you can charge the seed companies more money to do research there. They have a romantic connotation to their seed nursery, so this is my previous crop nursery. Oh, and I have fertilizer nurseries too. And one day after a fall chisel plow, here's soybeans the previous crop, here's third-year corn residue. I mean, look at that difference in soil tilth. Now soybeans is a taproot crop, and that taproot goes down and helps fracture soil compaction. So talk about a difference in mellow. On this side, I could skip across here in my bare feet. But when I got on this side, I might sprain my ankle, fall down, and gouge my eye out on a piece of stalk residue. Of course, the problem is root balls. Corn plants glue soil particles to their root while they're growing. It's called a rhizoshete. And that's a real good deal why the corn plants grow. It isn't quite as good a deal when you chisel plow it up later. So soybean doesn't do that. So root balls are the problem. And I hope you can imagine that this situation is going to change water infiltration and seed soil contact. And guess what? If you're planting here as opposed to here, you need to plant 10% more seed here to achieve the same stand because of these root balls. So, I mean, the seed guy feels my pain when I'm on corn and he sells me 10% more seed. So this is secretly the second favorite. And it's an example of a tillage, previous crop plant population interaction. And number 7 this is a catch-all that I call growth regulators. Okay, to get the name, these are compounds that regulate growth, hopefully in a positive manner. Greener longer is better than browner faster, and they can both be growth regulators. The browner faster is a growth regulator herbicide. And be warned, just because a compound purports to be a growth regulator does not guarantee you're going to get a 10 bushel increase in yield, because this category has the widest range. And you're actually more likely to decrease yield if you use the wrong growth regulator, the wrong hybrid, the wrong weather. And there's some riffraff that operates in the growth regulator category. But there are some legitimate growth regulators. There's some seed treatments that give a legitimate improvement in emergence, help you achieve your plant population. And the growth regulator treatment I'm going to talk about is the stay green. The leaf performance or leaf health that comes from a strobilurium fungicide like quilting cellar headline, even in the absence of disease, or a lot of visual disease. Here's how the story goes. I fly the fungicide on, usually the first week of July. It's like a fine mist over the top of the crop. If I'm not out there watching them do it, I have to take it on faith they sprayed the right field. And then 50 days later, the lower leaves show up greener. And since it's the lower leaves that feed the stalk and the root, there's going to be a huge improvement in standability and harvest speed. Since the leaves are the business end of the crop, sometimes this can give me heavier kernels, and I get an increase in yield, even when I don't see any leaf disease. And there's a lot of debate on what causes this. But I'm going to tell you that strobilurium fungicides act as anti-ethylene agents. Ethylene is a senescence hormone. So I'm going to tell you that this is an ethylene-induced change in the senescence trajectory of the leaf. And that's why I put it in the growth regulator class. Now there's a lot of interest in growth regulators, because this is the only category that I could have 2 of, presumably score 2 10 bushel increases, that would be 20. In other words, I might have a seed treatment that score 10, and I might follow it up with a fungicide, score another 10. And if I could develop a growth regulator that controlled the weather, then I'd rule agriculture, I'll tell you this. Better hope that doesn't end up in my hands. Now, if I have good weather and I've optimized the value of each one of these wonders, I should be able to grow 260 bushels. And by gosh, I can, in the rare cases that the weather cooperates. And by the same token, if one of these wonders is not optimized, you're going to grow less than that. And I will bet every one of you a year of my salary that if I set my mind to it, I can grow less than 260 bushels by screwing up one of these wonders. I usually don't have to try all that hard. about 260, it's not 300. So how are you going to use this concept to grow 300? Well, the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to optimize each of these wonders and their positive interactions. Remember, I said that these things all interact with each other. This is what vexes you all each year. Sort of what keeps me in business. And I'm thinking if you had 7 kids, how many fights or alliances they could all get into, but think of how fantastic it would be when all 7 got together and worked for a common cause. You're farming. Apparently that's how we used to do farming before we had all this big machinery. That's an example of positive interaction. So you have to optimize each of these wonders and their positive interactions, and guess what? Again, you want to send your son or daughter to a fantastic school like the University of Illinois, you got to have better prerequisites. And in order to grow 300 bushels, you're also going to have better prerequisites. So the key is optimizing each of the wonders and their positive interactions and providing better prerequisites. I'm not going to talk much about it, but as satisfying as it is to kill a 2-foot giant ragweed with glyphosate, I'm pretty sure I've lost some yield by that point. I mean, you're going to have season-long weed control, pre-emergent control, going to have to be. The good news is that the weed never emerges, apparently could never get resistant either, so season-long weed control. And the prerequisite I'm going to harp on a little bit is soil fertility. All right, you know how we base our soil fertility? It's on soil testing. So we take the soil test, sometimes we can adjust the pH, and that changes nutrient availability. But the soil testing tells us what we need to add. And then this is sort of a feed the soil approach. The adage used to be, well, fertilizer's cheap, I'll feed the soil, like money in the bank. And I think some of you have cashed that bank account in. I mean, I'm actually not convinced that soil test data is calibrated to 300 bushels. Now, if you got a low soil test, you better do something about it. But I'm not convinced that a medium or even a high soil test means that soil can release those nutrients fast enough. Particularly when you have 45,000 hungry roots to feed. And particularly when you're growing near 300 bushels, and especially for immobile nutrients like phosphate or micronutrients. I want you to think about when soil test data was calibrated. So soil test data was calibrated to yield very well up in the 60s. And I just got done showing you in the 60s, the average yield in the US was 70 bushels, you're growing 18,000 plants. And now we're growing twice that, and twice as many plants, we want to go even higher. I'm not convinced that a soil test is calibrated to the high yield. Now, low soil test, you better fix it. But a high soil test, I'm not convinced. So I think you're going to have to take a feed the plant approach rather than a feed the soil approach. So in other words, you're going to feed the plant what it needs, when it needs it. Everybody's going to be happy about that. I can claim that's sustainability. And you're going to use technology to do so. Biotechnology, that's roots that act longer, so the insects don't chew on them. Application technology, now with my autosteer, man, I can put fertilizer down to the centimeter. This would give me something to do with the autosteer, except talking to cell phone while I'm planting. And then I think you're going to have to use fertilizer technology. These are fertilizers that supply more than one key nutrient and or that have some aspect of that fertilizer that keeps it available over a longer time period. So I think you're going to have to take a feed the plant, not the feed the soil approach to consistently grow 300 bushels. Now, I don't know what it takes to grow 300 bushel corn, but I can tell you exactly what it takes to grow 230 bushel corn. 230 bushel corn, these are some of my favorite elements for high corn yield. And what I'm showing you here is how much of each of these elements have to be, are required to produce a 230 bushel crop. So in other words, this is how much of each of these the crop has to suck up over the course of the growing season. And I'm also showing you here of each of my favorite elements, how much of each of these elements is removed from the soil or from the land with rain. That's sort of analogous to fertilizer maintenance applications. So this is how much of the 230 bushel corn removes. And I've averaged this over a bunch of hybrids at a couple of sites, all commercial brands, all biotech insect protection. This is a graduate student work. You could squeeze a lot of juice out of a grad student, as part of their indentured servitude. And then I've shown you the harvest index here. And so the harvest index is, of the total amount that the crop sucks up, what percentage is removed with the grain? Now, I get excited about a nutrient as a limiting factor for high corn yields if one of two things happens. Either the crop needs a lot of it, like nitrogen, or potassium, or more importantly, the grain needs a lot of it. Okay, here's my stupid thinking. I want to grow a lot of grain. And so therefore, those elements that have a high grain requirement, or those elements that have a high harvest index, must be the most important ones to grow high grain yield. And 4 elements fit that criteria, and so my favorite 4 that have the highest harvest index are nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and the micronutrient zinc. Those are my 4 favorite for high corn yield. Now, here I'm showing you how much of each of these elements have to be absorbed by the crop. But the question is when? When's the sweet spot? When in the life of the crop do I need to have that nutrient? And where and why do I need it in the crop? So I'm only going to show it to you for 3 of them. Nitrogen, phosphate, and zinc in the interest of time. But I have a website that I'll show you at the end if you like this kind of stuff. And so let's talk about the first one, the nitrogen, you know, the second wonder. And I know this is a lot of information here. What I'm showing you is how much nitrogen is in the crop in pounds per acre in a 230 bushel crop as a function of time. And I've expressed time on thermal time, so this is growing degree days. And I've also expressed time on growth stage. So, you know, this V&R stuff. V is the number of leaves with collars, and R is the grain. I blame Iowa State for coming up with this, but that's the most common staging system which is known. And so I also divided the crop into its components: the leaf, the stalk, the cob, and the grain. And over here I show you the percentage of the total. So in other words, a 230 bushel corn crop over the course of the season has to suck up 250 pounds of N from fertilizer and soil, 60% of which is removed with the grain. Now, when's the sweet spot for nitrogen uptake? When do I have to make sure I have the nitrogen available? Well, that's right here. All right? If you look at V12, I should have put V12 on here, but I will interpolate. A V12 crop has 50 pounds of N per acre in it. An R1 crop has 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre in it. So in other words, between V12 and R1, that crop has to suck up 150 pounds of N. Okay, over roughly a 3-week period, usually the 3rd week of June to the 2nd week of July, I got to suck up 150 pounds of N. Okay, that's more than 7 pounds of N per day, every day for 21 straight days to grow 230 bushel corn. And I'm pretty sure it's higher for 300, by the way. And guess what? If I don't suck up my 7 today, I can't suck up 14 the next day. You know, I got to make sure it's available all that time period. And that's because I'm making the leaf and the stalk, you know, which are the business end of the crop. So after having to take up 7 pounds of N per day for 21 straight days, I got 200 pounds of N in the crop. That's 75% of the total. I still have to take up 50 pounds later. So I have to kind of hold 50 back. And then 50 pounds that's taken up later goes right to the grain. But guess what? That's not enough to meet the needs of the grain, so the leaf and the stalk can oblige themselves to support the grain. And this screams limiting factor, and it is, after all, the second wonder. This is nitrogen. It's even worse for phosphate. If I look at a 230 bushel corn crop, I got to take 100 pounds of P2O5 of phosphate. Okay, that's roughly 250 pounds of MAC, 80% of which is removed with the grain. All right, I bought 250 pounds of MAC. Sure, it cost me a fortune. And I thought, well, at least I'm fertilizing next year's soybean crop. But then the corn crop took it all up, and I removed 80% of it. That kind of explains why my soybean looks so lousy. Highest harvest index of any of the elements. Now again, if I look at and I want you to compare nitrogen. Notice nitrogen has a little slow time here, and it kind of slows off on its uptake pattern. Not phosphate, straight up the whole season. Got to have seasonal phosphate available to grow 230 bushel corn crop. Now again, there's 2 sweet spots for phosphate. One of them's right here, just at the same time I showed you for corn, or for nitrogen. Between V12 and R1, I got to take up roughly 50 pounds of P2O5. And in flowering, I only have half the phosphate that the crop needs. I've got to take up 50 pounds of P2O5 after flowering. Now, where do you suppose the roots are after flowering? Well, they're probably deeper, my guess. And that explains why if I take a 2-foot soil sample on a lot of your fields, they're really phosphate 2 foot down, and you mine it all up for high corn yields. This is probably the most overlooked element for high corn yield because of its very substantial post-flowering uptake. You need to take it up season long. Now I'll show you one micronutrient. Oh, and if you like this stuff in metric units, there's a scientific publication that you can look at it in. And I'll show you a website at the end that's got the rest of the elements. My favorite micronutrient, this is one that goes hand in hand with phosphate, or at least sort of, and that's the only micronutrient that looks like this, and this is the micronutrient zinc. So this is the pattern zinc uptake for 230 bushel corn, and again I got a screaming uptake rate here during late vegetative. But in flowering, just like I showed you for phosphate, only half the zinc the crop needs is actually in the crop at flowering. It has to have half of its zinc after flowering. And again, this explains why if I look at your soil zinc levels, they're probably all low. I mean, you mine it all out. Why do it? Now, I had a bright idea, and I said, well, geez, I'll just coat the seed with some zinc. That's not what it needs it. That's the problem. I had another bright idea, and I said, well, I'll just spray some zinc on the plant. Now, that'll teach it. And if the leaves are deficient in zinc, that'll make it happy. But once the zinc is in the leaf, it's immobile. It doesn't actually move to the grain. So that zinc that the grain needs has to come in the plant through the root. And so my idea of a better prerequisite is to feed the plant what it needs, when it needs it. And my 4 favorite elements for high yield corn are nitrogen, phosphate, sulfur, and zinc. And then knowing that, and something about the 7 wonders, we came up with a high-tech package, a 5-factor high-tech package that we compared to a grower standard package. And the grower standard here is in orange, high-tech's in blue. So I don't know what your grower standard is, but I hope this is close. So on the standard side, either I was blessed with a high salt test, so I didn't put any Peter K, or I put it on maintenance in the fall. On the nitrogen side, I used 180 pounds pre-plant N as UAN. And that would generally be a pretty good practice. In my state, we do that in the fall for convenience sake, which isn't quite as good. On the genetic side, what I'm actually doing is I'm comparing the value of biotech insect protection. So I use the refuge hybrid. I mean, nobody in my state would do that. Well, they would on 20%, I hope. And 32,000 plants per acre, no fungicide. And this is weed-free. I got Bluemax at full rate over this. You know, I can't afford that myself on my own farm, but yeah, I get it for free, so I got it at full rate. It's not weed out there. Now on the high-tech side, in blue, even though the soil test said I didn't need it, I broadcast in the spring right ahead of planting 100 pounds P2O5 is Mosaic's Micro Essentials SC. And that's MAP that has sulfur and zinc in the same granule. And some of the sulfur is fine ground elemental sulfur. And so this fine ground elemental sulfur acidifies the granule, helps keep the phosphate and the zinc more available, and provides a slow release source of sulfur. And it just so happens to provide my 4 favorite nutrients all in the same granule. So that 100 pounds P2O5 is 250 pounds product. That would also be 35 pounds of N, 25 pounds of sulfur, and 2.5 pounds of zinc. That's my better prerequisite. And, on the nitrogen side, in addition to the 180 pounds, I side-dressed another 100. Kind of an over-the-top recommendation. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of N there, you know, during that critical period. And I used super urea. And I thought, with a name like super urea, you know, how could it not be marvelous? That's Agrotane Plus. So that's stabilized urea that won't volatilize or leach, so it's weatherproof. On the genetic side, I use the same hybrid, but I use the triple stack hybrid counterpart. You know, so that biotech above and below ground insect protection. Looking at the value of insect protection here. And you might recognize the abbreviation for DeKalb. I use DeKalb genetics. And this is not necessarily an endorsement of DeKalb genetics, but there was thousands of good reasons why I used DeKalb genetics in this. 45,000 plants per acre, and you know why I did that. And this is before I was jaded by failure in twin rows. And then I use then I put the fungicide on. And I usually use headline, but I get a fair amount of funding from Syngenta, so this works just as well. And this is not a recommendation, by the way. This is designed to show you the biological capability of a systems approach. You know, and then it's up to you working with your, Arthur companies or guys who know your soil and your personalities better, to tweak this into your comfort level. But I wouldn't be here today if not over 2 years, 2 good years, 2009 and 2010. In a good year, by the way, it's rained in July. I wouldn't be here today if not over 2 good years in my state at a couple locations. The high-tech package on average didn't yield 50 bushels more than the standard. And it's not that the standard is bad corn, that's almost 200 bushel of corn. It's that the high-tech is 50 bushels more. And I show you here the appearance of the plants, look at how green they are. Those are well fed, but that's 45,000 of them. Now if I had 5 factors, if I have a 5-factor package that yields 50 bushels more, are each of these factors worth 10? Or is one factor worth more than the other factors? In other words, if this is my basketball team, who's the superstar of the team? Who's the LeBron James that I have to pay for regardless of cost? Or who's the slacker? Which means I could bench him, or better yet, not pay for it. That is a very difficult statistical question. So in order to answer the question, who's the superstar, who's the slacker in this package, we came up with a new experimental design, and we call it a mission plot. I know you hate experimental designs. I'm a glutton for punishment, so I'm going to try this anyway, and it's a good thing you haven't eaten yet. And if you don't understand this design, you're not going to understand the rest of the data I show you, so you might as well take out the cell phone. 12 treatments. I had the high-tech system, that's the full Monty, it's in blue. Then I had the standard system, that's in orange. And I'm going to harken this to like a basketball team, right? 5 players. So this is my pro team, this is my high school team, and I'll assume that the pro team usually beats the high school team. And then what I do is I take the high school player at each position, and I put it on the pro team, and I see how badly that one high school player drags down the performance of these other 4 pro players. And I do that for every position. Hence the name of mission plot. And then at the same time, I take the pro player and I put him on the high school team, one at a time, and I see how well one pro player can elevate the performance of these other 4 high school players. And again, I do that at every position. And this is sort of like standard agronomy if I had 5 side-by-sides. And this makes a fantastic visual demonstration in the field because I can see a huge difference in yield in a very small area. And then I can walk these plots and I can root for my favorite player or factor, which is probably whatever it is I'm trying to sell you. So I put this mission plot in my state, 2 years, a couple locations. And what I'm going to show you is this side of the curve first. So in other words, if you're only going to do one thing of these 5, which one should it be? So here's the standard side, again, averaged over a couple of years, couple of locations. On average, 193 bushels. And now I'm looking at the impact of adding one thing. So in other words, if I added the extra fertility, I gained 4 bushels. If I had the extra nitrogen that was weather protected, I gained 5. If I use the biotech insect protected genetics instead of the refuge, I gained 9. That's the superstar. That's why triple stacks have been so widely adapted, and that's why I'm pretty sure my neighbor has sufficient refuge for me to tap into. I had another idea. I wonder if anyone's ever thought of this. I'll just buy the refuge seed, then I'll return it after the season. Sorry, I'm not giving these guys any ideas. That's why we have resistance development, by the way. And that's why pretty soon, well, almost now, the refuge is in the bag, the rib, so you can't cheat anymore. And now the compliance is on me instead of you. And in order to prove to you that the refuge is actually in the bag, the seed has to be a different color. So I guess if you're tenacious enough, you can pick the colored ones out. Now, if I ran the population up to 45,000, oh man, I made my cousin happy, but I gave up 7 bushels, so don't do that. You can't just run the population up without committing to it. And then when I put the fungicide on, I gained 5. So these are mostly baby steps. At least 4 of them are in the right direction, but they're mostly baby steps. I mean, and now let's say I was going to go for broke and buy and put on all 5. I got a big tax liability, so I got to pre-buy all these. And based on their individual value, I'd sum them all up, I'd have to subtract that one. Based on their individual value, I would predict a 17 bushel gain if I used all 5. But it's really 50. You know, so apparently these guys work together as a team to support the performance of the other players. It's the old teamwork approach. Now I'm going to show you the high side, what happens if I leave one of the factors out. And what you're going to see is it's not the one thing that you do for high yield, it's what you don't do as part of the high-tech package that has the opportunity to kill you. So here's on the high-tech side, now it's up to 245 bushels, 50 bushels more, 52 actually. And now I'm looking at the impact of omitting the factor from the package. In other words, if I left out that extra fertility, I lost 9 bushels. If I didn't have that extra nitrogen that was weather protected, I lost 13. If I had the refuge genetics, even though I managed the crap out of it, I lost 20 bushels. If I only did 32,000 plants per acre, with all that management, man, every year it's filled to the tip, it looks fantastic, but there's not enough plants, so I give up 7. That's the swing player. And if I had more plants that were well fed and protected from insects, and I didn't finish it off with the fungicide, I lost a whopping 27. So this is the one thing I did that gave me high yield. It's what I talked to was